This morning we're going to begin to make our way into the book of Joshua. So we finished the first 5 books of the Bible, and now we are into that section of the canon of the Old Testament that in Christian Bibles we typically call the historical books. In the Jewish canon they're called the former prophets. And that's because part of what's going on is that there are actually prophets in these books, so there's a difference in terminology. Before we actually get into Joshua, I want to say a few words of introduction about it. We haven't done this with any of the other books, but the reason why I'm doing it with Joshua is Joshua, I think, presents a series of kind of interpretive challenges. And so I want to just let you know what some of those challenges are. We're not going to try and resolve all of them because that would take us far, far afield, but I just want you to know what some of them are. So one of the challenges of reading Joshua or thinking about it is looking at the picture that it creates of the settling of the land of Canaan. Now, sometimes people will refer to this as the conquest of Canaan. I'm not going to use that term for one reason, basically, and that is to talk about the conquest of Canaan seems to sort of create the idea that basically what's going on is sort of like a kind of an Israelite military operation, when clearly that's really not what's happening here at all. The book of Joshua is very clear on the fact that the reason why the people of Israel are allowed to enter the land of Canaan and to settle there is because God makes that possible. So we will be reading about battles in the book of Joshua. The thing that is interesting about each battle is that Israel's sort of military competence is almost like negligible, because in each case the real sort of actor in the battle is God. So this isn't really a story about what great military tacticians the Israelites were, what a great general Joshua was. Those really are not themes here. So I'm going to talk about the settling of the land of Canaan. Anyway, one of the difficulties in kind of looking at this picture of the settling of the land is that we get two sort of somewhat contradictory, or at least oppositional reads on it. So in the first half of Joshua, and I'll be pointing this out, in the first half of Joshua, we almost get a sense that the settling took place very quickly and was basically sort of totally brought about in a relatively short period of time. And you'll see this as we walk through some of the pace of the various battles, that it seems that it unrolls very quickly and it's all kind of over and done with in a relatively short period of time. On the other hand, in the second half of the book, we get a somewhat different perspective. That is, it seems that the settling of the land has taken actually a long time. So that by the time we get past the first half of the book, Joshua is sort of like getting old and they're already thinking about a replacement for him. And also, we're given indications that the settling of the land actually was not complete at all. There are still sort of like groups and communities of Canaanites who are actually still present in various places and in various forms. So we get kind of differing views on the settlement. And the question is, well, why is that? That is, why do we get these differing indications? And there are kind of various ways of addressing that. Let me offer one way, which I think is or can be helpful, and it's this. A lot of biblical scholars think that the book of Joshua kind of arrived at the form that we have it now, its final form, at some point during or after the Babylonian exile of 586 BC. Now, if that's true, that would be really significant, because that would mean that the narrative of Joshua is recounting the settling of the land to an Israel that is now currently landless, exiled in Babylon. What the Babylonians did in 586 BC is they completely demolished the city of Jerusalem, tore down the walls, destroyed the temple, removed most of sort of like the elite literate population, drug them all off to Babylon, and then resettled other people from other parts of their empire in the land of Canaan. So if this is true, then the story of the settling of the land of Canaan is being told at a point when Israel is radically unsettled. And there are a number of, I think, of important things that come from that. That is, the Babylonian exile raises two really important, deep, and fundamental theological questions. Question number one is, because the Babylonian exile was brought about by Israel's sort of chronic infidelity, the question arises as to whether Israel's infidelity to the covenant will ever be resolved. Is that possible? So that's a huge question that arises out of the exile. Is, if you want to think about Israel's sort of infidelity, you might want to think about it almost as sort of like a bleeding wound. Can this bleeding wound on the body of God's people finally be healed? Or are they kind of like destined to do like the same stuff over and over and over again? So that's one question. A second question is, because the Babylonians kind of swept in and destroyed Jerusalem and destroyed the temple and relocated much of the population of Israel, it raises the question of whether God's providence is really sovereign over human history. Later on in Isaiah, we'll get an answer to that question. But at this point, right, we've got these two really important, deep, and fundamental questions kind of hanging over us. It's the question of human sinfulness and the question of the sovereignty and providence of God and God's purposes being worked out. One way of reading the book of Joshua is that it's offering an answer to those questions, while at the same time looking back at the story or the narrative of the settling of the land. So here's how that might work. In the context of not having any land, and in the context of the question of how Israel is going to be cured of her sinfulness, there is an expectation that God is going to send an agent, a Messiah, to effect both those things. That is, the hope here, right, for a landless Israel is that somehow God is going to send a Messiah, a deliverer, who will restore Israel, not just to the way it was before, but who will restore Israel in terms of righteousness and bringing the people back together, and even beyond that, who will finally restore God's dominion over the whole of the creation. And therefore, it's important, for us to kind of realize something that was obvious to early Christian readers of the book of Joshua that's less obvious to us. And that is that the central figure of the New Testament, whom we know today as Jesus, his name is simply a derivative of the name Joshua. The name Joshua in Hebrew is Yehoshua. Jesus' name is simply an abbreviated form of that name, Yeshua, rendered as Jesus. So early Christian readers saw the book of Joshua, and they saw the central character of Joshua as, in effect, a promise of the deliverer, the Messiah, who would come and who would finally deal with the problem of the sinfulness of God's people, and who would finally establish God's dominion over the whole of the earth. So that's certainly a helpful way of thinking about Joshua. It was certainly the way that early Christians read the book of Joshua. Now, another thing we want to kind of think of as we begin to read Joshua is, and this is really important, the chief sort of agent, the chief actor in the book of Joshua really isn't Joshua or the people of Israel, but rather it's God. We'll see this when we take a look at the first chapter of the book of Joshua. That is, this is where Joshua needs to be read in continuity with the first 5 books of the Bible. Remember, right? How did the people of Israel get out of the land of Egypt? How were they able to escape from the world's most powerful empire? And the answer, of course, was they were delivered by God. That theme now continues in the book of Joshua because having delivered the people out of Egypt, God's now responsible for their settling in the land of Canaan. So God's, in effect, the chief character. This is almost like a helpful way to think about this is to think about it as almost like the book of Acts. While we refer to, right, the book of Acts, the official name of Acts is the Acts of the Apostles. When I was a little boy, whenever I heard that, I always thought of not ACTS, but AXE. And I had this vision of the apostles like dragging around this enormous axe that they were going to use for something. I don't know what. But the book of Acts really is, when you think about it, not so much a book about the acts of the apostles, but it's really a book about the acts of the Holy Spirit, who from Acts 2 on, right, is the chief actor. So Joshua is very much the same. God's the chief actor here in the book of Joshua. Now, another thing that we want to pay attention to also is what Joshua has to say, either directly or indirectly, about what's going on in the various sort of Canaanite city-states. So just a quick word about that. So the people of Israel, right, have left Egypt. They've crossed the wilderness. They've crossed the Jordan River. They're about to enter into the land of Palestine. And it's already inhabited, by and large, by these kind of powerful Canaanite city-states. So these are all like walled cities that are ruled over by kings. They have professional armies. They're primarily urban civilizations. The people of Israel are not urban, right? They're kind of herdsmen and things like that. So two very different cultures. And we just want to kind of take seriously, right, how intimidating on the surface this must have looked. Okay, these kind of powerful urban civilizations with armies and kings and, you know, walled cities and advanced military strategy and military hardware and the whole 9 yards. But the book of Joshua actually wants us to look past that to something else. The book of Joshua actually wants us to look past all that to what those Canaanite city-states represent. What they represent are what you might call the politics and religion of sin. So in each one of these Canaanite city-states, right, we have basically sort of like despotic human rulers who rule over societies characterized by vast levels of inequality. And in these rules are sort of propping up and are propped up by the worship of various pagan gods, so that it's really important to notice this, right? In this world, literally politics and religion are indistinguishable. The whole effort here, right, is that each one of the city-states has their own set of gods and goddesses, and the idea is the gods and goddesses want whoever is currently ruling over you to be there, or at least that's what they're telling you. Okay, so we have this interesting situation where we have, in effect, right, sort of a corrupt human political order and a corrupt human religious order, all kind of wrapped into one gigantic corrupt civilization. And God's goal in the book of Joshua is to eliminate them, to clear them out, and to establish his own dominion or rule in their place. So it's really important, I think, to kind of read Joshua in this way. I'll point out, and this isn't just sort of like a little footnote, but one of the things that's really interesting about all the battle accounts in the book of Joshua, whenever a city-state falls, the emphasis of the story really isn't so much on the city, but rather on the king. That kind of lets us know what the focus is. It is what's going on in the book of Joshua is that those who have usurped God's creation are going to find themselves usurped. There's a sense in which the book of Joshua is like politically explosive in some ways. Certainly if you're a Canaanite king, it really is explosive in a kind of literal sense. The warfare or the battle that goes on here, I'll say more about this in a minute, probably needs to be read in light of something that happens in the 19th chapter of the book of Revelation. I'm going to go ahead and read it to you because I think it kind of helps at a number of levels. The book of Revelation, too, is filled with some heavenly combat and earthly combat as well. I'm going to read to you from one of the final combat scenes. This is Revelation 19, 11 through 21. And we just want to kind of note what happens and also what doesn't happen. Then I saw heaven opened, and behold, a white horse. Of course, horses here are military animals, which is why, of course, it's important to note that when Jesus enters to Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, right, he rides on a donkey, not on a horse. The white horse, of course, being the horse that would have been ridden by a conquering general. Then I saw heaven open, and behold, a white horse, and the one sitting on the horse is called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he judges and makes war. His eyes are like a flame of fire, on his head are many diadems, and he has a name written that no one knows but himself. He is clothed in a robe dipped in blood, and the name by which he is called is the Word of God. Here, Word of God is like a proper name. And the armies of heaven, arrayed in fine linen, white and pure, were following him on white horses. From his mouth comes a sharp sword with which to strike down the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron. He will tread the winepress of the fury of the wrath of God the Almighty, and on his robe and on his thigh are written, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. So this tells us who the rider on the white horse is. But as you read further and as you see how this battle unfolds, what you find out, right, is that what the human combatants do in it is essentially insignificant. The real fighter in this battle is the one who's sitting on the white horse, the one who is denominated as the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. We'll see something very similar playing out in the book of Joshua. Now, another thing about Joshua that we just want to kind of note at the outset is there's a depiction of war here, and I want to say a word about that. It is sometimes what's referred to in the book of Joshua as we watch the destruction of the Canaanite city-states. Sometimes people will describe this as holy war. I'm not going to use that term for a number of reasons. Once again, one of the reasons why I'm not going to use it is it's actually not used in Joshua or anywhere in the Old Testament. As if you flip through the Old Testament, you will never find the phrase holy war. Okay, so that suggests it's a good reason not to make use of it. Also, holy wars tends to be like a more modern concept, and it kind of suggests all manner of things that kind of, in a sense, confuse rather than clarify. So I'm going to take the alternative step of simply using the Hebrew word that the book of Joshua uses, not to kind of like sound impressive or anything like that, but just for the sake of clarity. So the word that Joshua uses here is the Hebrew word herem, not to be confused with the word harem. Okay, those are like two very different things. So we're talking about harem warfare, not harems. Okay. So what is harem warfare? Well, it's something like this. In the ancient world, the whole purpose of fighting wars of conquest was to get something, right? So the idea is that in the ancient world, right, you didn't like tax your people and then use that money to like pay a professional army. You sent your army out to conquer someone, and the funds that came from that's what was used to pay the army. So armies were sort of seen not as something you spent money on. Armies were seen as like sources of revenue. That's how the Roman Empire worked. So in the ancient world, right, you fought a war of conquest, and what you did, right, was you gathered up all the people that were left and sold them into slavery. If there were valuable things present, you took that, and that was how you financed what you did. Harem warfare works on a very different principle. Harem warfare works on the principle that nothing is taken. Everything is devoted to destruction. That's what harem means. Everything is devoted to destruction, almost as if everything becomes kind of like a gigantic burnt offering. So this is a very different sort of way of thinking about warfare. And we just want to kind of remember that's what's going on in the book of Joshua, is this harem warfare. Well, let's take a look now at the beginning of the first chapter of Joshua and sort of get our bearings now that we've kind of gotten a few things at least somewhat clear or less muddy than they might have otherwise been. So it's really interesting, right? The book of Joshua literally picks up directly from the end of Deuteronomy. It's almost like no time has elapsed. Moses has gone up on Mount Nebo. God's taken Moses' life, and now we have God speaking to Joshua. And we just want to notice what God says to Joshua here in Joshua 1, 1 through 9. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua the son of Nun, Moses' assistant, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise, go over this Jordan, you and all this people, into the land that I'm giving to them, to the people of Israel. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given you, just as I promised. Notice here, not I'm going to give you, but I have. That's why I'm not using the word conquest. God's already basically given the land to Joshua already. From the wilderness of this Lebanon as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, to all the land of the Hittites, the great sea, toward the going down of the sun, shall be your territory. No man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. Just as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not leave you or forsake you. Be strong and courageous, for you shall cause this people to inherit the land that I swore to their fathers to give them. Only be strong and very courageous, being careful and to do all the law according to Moses my servant commanded you. Do not turn to it from the right or from the left, that you may have good success wherever you go. This book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do according to all that is written in it. For then you shall make your way prosperous, and then you will have good success. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened, and do not be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. So notice what God's saying to Joshua. I think this is really important. Thing number one, Joshua here is given the only one promise, essentially, and it was the same promise that God gave to Moses before he sent him to talk to Pharaoh. And that's basically the only promise that any human being really needs. I will be with you. I will be with you. And, right, the other side of that is, and you need to trust that. Right? That is, the other side of I will be with you is, okay, you need to now act as if I really am with you and not be nervous or frightened or whatever. So this is the promise that was made to Moses, and now it's reaffirmed to Joshua. Also, as I pointed out, right, I've already given you this land. It's already yours. I promised it to your fathers. I'm giving it to you. It's already yours, so go ahead and settle in it. And this tells us right off the bat that what we're about to read about in the book of Joshua really is not about military strategy or how great the Israelites were in battle or anything like this. We're being told here that the settling of the land is a direct result of something that God is doing over and over and over. Another really interesting thing here is what God says in Joshua 1:4. It's kind of like a rough sketch of the land that Joshua is going to inherit. And this is really interesting. From the wilderness and this Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites and the great sea, to the going down of the sun shall be your territory. It's interesting that the scope of the land here that's described is actually something that Israel actually never settles. Not even under Solomon is Israel this extensive. And so this may be an indication, right, that God is speaking here not simply about the territory of Israel, but his own dominion over the whole world. That might be something that's along the horizon here. But we want to go back to what God says to Joshua here by way of encouragement. Be strong and courageous, for you shall cause this people to inherit the land. Now, that's another interesting word, right? Inherit the land, right? Once again, not you shall cause this people to conquer it. You shall cause this people to inherit it. Now, right, as we all know, right? When you inherit something, that means that someone's given you something, right? Your dear distant relative dies, and lo and behold, you discover in their will, right, that, great old Uncle Fred, who knew, left you $1 million. You always knew you liked Uncle Fred, right? But the idea right here is that the people of Israel are not conquering anything. They're not taking anything. They're really not doing anything, strictly speaking. They're inheriting something from God. That's the point, okay? This is coming to them from God. And then this is kind of like this, this bracing word to Joshua. Only be strong and very courageous, being careful to do according to the law of Moses my servant commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right nor from the left, that you may have good success wherever you go. The book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night, that you may be careful to do according to all that is written in it. And as I've noted before, this book of the law probably is a reference to the book of Deuteronomy. So notice what's going on. The thing that Joshua is supposed to focus on most is not military strategy or planning or battle tactics or, what people need to be commanding, which parts of the army. The thing that should be uppermost in the mind of Joshua, the thing that should be implanted in his heart, in his mind, in his soul, is what God has commanded his people in the book of Deuteronomy. That is, what's being asked of Joshua is not that he kind of make himself into a kind of like military genius, right? A kind of Israelite Patton or something like that. But what's required of Joshua is the same thing that was required of Moses, is the primary qualification for leadership here is faithfulness. That's the primary requirement. If you don't have that, any other talent or any other ability will be wasted. Joshua is primarily to be a man of faith, a man who is under the Word of God, a man who lives, eats, sleeps, and drinks the book of Deuteronomy, and who knows what God expects of his people. And he's to meditate on it day and night. And then this, and then once again, it's interesting how many times God reaffirms this to Joshua. So, as you're reading through this, God keeps saying, be strong, be courageous, I'll be with you. Be strong, be courageous, I'll be with you. Be strong, be courageous, I'll be with you. And it's like, come on, God. Joshua's not dumb. He probably heard you the first time. But that's not the point. The point is that God knows, right, that this needs to be reaffirmed to Joshua at regular intervals. Okay? When you're dealing with this ragtag bunch of nomadic people who know nothing about urban warfare, who are going up against armies that have armor and chariots and bronze spears and walled cities and the whole 9 yards, right? When that's what you're up against, your first inclination is going to be fear. And so Joshua, I think, here sets up a really important kind of way of thinking about faith. That is, I think one could say here that one might see, as it's framed here, one might see, right, that faith is the opposite of fear. Notice here that faith doesn't mean that Joshua knows exactly what's going to happen. God doesn't sit Joshua down, in front of a video screen and say, okay, Joshua, here's how this is going to unfold. Let me show you the movie. Here it is. Here's how this battle's going to go, and this battle's going to go, and this battle's going to go, and you're just going to go from victory to victory to victory. This is going to be great. Are you ready? No. Joshua doesn't know how all this is going to unfold. He doesn't know how the people of Israel are going to respond to him exactly, right? What he does know is that they didn't respond all that well to Moses. Okay? And when people don't respond like really well to Moses, like you kind of have like some doubts as to how they might respond to you. All that's left. But what Joshua is told, right, is basically the one thing that God believes he really does need to know. And that is, I will be with you. I'm not leaving you. I won't forsake you. I will never let you go. I will be with you all the way. Trust in that and then act accordingly. And so with that, Joshua is told to march forward. Now, one way, I mentioned a while back, right, that this would be the last thing we'd look at. I mentioned a while back, right, that early Christians read the book of Joshua as essentially being about Christ. And here's one place where we can see where that reading actually might be not only be true, but also be helpful. Think about the one figure in all of Scripture who never doubted the presence and power of God and the kind of life that made possible. Joshua truly here is, right, a kind of a forerunner, a foreshadowing, a prefiguration of Christ. We're going to see that Joshua doesn't completely live into this vocation. There are times when he kind of worries. There are times when he, does things that aren't the best or the most wise. But what we have here, right, is one of the qualifications for this person who's going to come and be the Joshua, who's going to deal with the problem of human sinfulness, who is going to finally reunite the people of God and establish God's dominion over the whole of the earth. That person is going to live in such a way that he never, ever doubts the presence and power of God. And that faith is going to make a very, very unique life possible. And therefore, right, there's kind of like Joshua here, and there's Old Covenant Joshua, New Covenant Joshua, and there's an important connection between them. Next Sunday, we'll finish chapter 1, and we'll get into chapter 2. And we'll see here that when we get into chapter 2, we meet one of my favorite characters in the Old Testament, Rahab, who plays a really important role in this story. And as you may know, Rahab is interesting at a number of levels, but perhaps one of the reasons why she's interesting is because she's in the entertainment business. More about that next Sunday.